Chapter 27. Deductions from various attributes of the soul. It has often been said that no proposition is worthy of belief that is not verified by phenomena. Whilst I do not commit myself to a maxim so broad in its terms, I have thus far religiously refrained from advancing an idea that is not so verified. In other words, the primary object of this book is to interpret phenomena, and not to advance new ideas, except those which are thrust upon me as necessary deductions from the terms of my hypothesis. Sincerely believing that the fundamental propositions of that hypothesis are true, I have not hesitated to follow them into whatever field they might lead, and to accept every legitimate conclusion. In pursuance of such deductions, I have been led reluctantly to the conclusion that none of the phenomena commonly attributed to supramundane agencies afford tangibly evidence of the continued existence of the soul after the death of the body. I have, however, been more than compensated by the discovery, in pursuance of the same hypothesis, that in the inherent powers and attributes of the soul is to be found indubitable evidence of its immortality. This evidence is based on phenomena which have been, and may be, produced by experiment. Many of these phenomena have been already pointed out, but others remain to be considered which have an important bearing upon the question under immediate consideration, namely, the immortality of the soul and its relations to the Supreme Being. There are still other attributes and powers of the soul which have been considered, from which further conclusions may be drawn which may assist us in forming correct conclusions regarding its status in a future life. The first of these attributes which I purpose briefly to discuss is that of memory, and its relations to the question of spirit identity. The question as to whether the soul of man retains its identity after the death of the body is second only in interest and importance to the question of immortality. There are many who hold that the soul is necessarily reabsorbed into the divine essence, and finds its compensation for the ills of earthly life in becoming an integral part of God, and, as such, a participator in his power and glory. This presupposes a loss of identity, and to most minds would be considered equivalent to annihilation. By others it is regarded as the highest conception of eternal felicity. Thus far no one, as far as I am aware, has attempted to offer any scientific reasons for believing one way or the other. It seems to me that there is abundant evidence in phenomena observable in this life to demonstrate, as far as such a proposition is demonstrable, that the soul does retain its identity in a more pronounced degree, if possible, than we can retain it in this objective existence. In what does identity consist, or, more properly speaking, how is it retained? The answer is, through our consciousness and memory. It is obvious that if either is lost, identity is lost. It is equally obvious that if both are retained, identity is retained. Now, the phenomena alluded to which bear upon the question relate to the perfect memory of the subjective mind, or soul. This faculty of subjective memory is implanted in the human soul for some purpose. It certainly does not pertain to this life, for, as we have seen, it is only under abnormal conditions that the phenomenon is observable. It must, therefore, be a part of the divine economy pertaining to the future existence of the soul. It has no use here, for objective recollection is all sufficient for objective existence and purposes. The conclusion is irresistible that it is for the purpose, amongst other things, of enabling the soul to retain its identity. Its bearing upon the question of future rewards and punishments has already been commented upon. Nevertheless, at the risk of repetition, a further remark will be ventured. It is obvious that if the soul did not retain a conscious memory of its earthly life, no adequate or just reward or punishment could be meted out to it. Even human justice would revolt against, and human laws would prevent, the infliction of the penalty for a capital crime, if it were clearly proved that the criminal had so far lost his mind as to have no recollection of the events of his past life, or, in other words, had lost conscious identity. Besides, it must not be forgotten that the soul is the seat of the emotions, as well as the storehouse of memory. It is obvious that it is only through the emotions and the memory that rewards can be conferred, or punishments inflicted, upon the immaterial soul. Another question which has been incidentally alluded to deserves a more extended notice, for the reason that it bears directly upon the question of future rewards and punishments, and is also illustrative of the general hypothesis under consideration. It is the question of conscience. Metaphysicians are divided in opinion on this question, one school holding that conscience is innate and instinctive, and the other that it is the result of experience and education. My hypothesis leads to the conclusion that each school is partly right and partly wrong. Granted that the eternal principles of right and wrong are a part of the fixed and immutable laws of God, it follows that the soul of man will, under favorable conditions, have a clear perception of those laws. Those conditions may or may not be present during the life of the body. They certainly will be present when the soul is freed from the clogs of the flesh and is able to perceive all the fixed laws of nature. In the meantime, while it is an inhabitant of the body, it is amenable to control by the power of objective suggestion, and hence is dependent upon the objective education of the individual for its standard of right and wrong. This standard may be high or low in any individual case. There will be one standard in one community and another in another, all depending upon education and social environment. But in each case, the subjective mind will follow the suggestions imparted to it by objective education. If the standard is high in any individual case, the sentiment will gradually become instinctive, so that the subjective impulses and emotions will play an important part. If the standard is low, the instinctive emotions will only be conspicuous for their absence. Man stands in his relation to the principles of right and wrong in just the same position that he occupies in his relation to the laws of electricity or any other natural law. He is struggling to ascertain the laws in each case for the purpose of placing himself in harmony with them. His knowledge is of slow growth, but each century finds the general standard of right and wrong higher than it was the century before. If the soul possessed, in the normal condition of man, an instinctive knowledge of those laws, he would not have to await the slow process of evolution to develop them. History records the name of but one man in whom the eternal principles of right and wrong were instinctive. That man was Jesus Christ. He perceived those laws, as he perceived all spiritual laws, while yet in the flesh. We may profit by his example and his precepts, but otherwise we must work out our own salvation, knowing that, when the soul reaches its final home, it will be in possession of the eternal standard by which to measure the guilt or innocence of every deed done in the body. The only remaining psychic phenomena which I propose to discuss are those connected with that emotion of the human soul which finds its expression in the worship of the Supreme Being. This feeling is so widespread that no system of philosophy is complete that does not take it into account. Like every other emotion, it has its normal mode of expression and its abnormal manifestations. The difference between the two modes of expression is so great that their identity of origin has been, to a great extent, lost sight of. The abnormal manifestation of this emotion now occurs principally among the uncultivated classes of religious worshippers, and the feeling has been somewhat contemptuously designated as emotional religion. It is conspicuous in the revival meetings of certain religious sects, where in former years its manifestations were so violent and unseemly that it was looked upon as reprehensible, but these exhibitions have been, of late years, generally repressed, except among the lower orders of the people. Scientists have tried to account for it on the ground that it is the result of mesmeric power consciously or unconsciously exerted by the preachers over their congregations, resulting in an ecstatic emotion wholly abnormal and entirely unconnected with true religion. The fact that it sometimes results in a cataleptic condition and sometimes in a trance undistinguishable from that produced by hypnotic processes lent color to the theory, and has gradually brought the educated classes to regard the feeling of religious emotion with distrust. The result is that what used to be known as vital religion is gradually becoming a thing of the past and is giving place to a cold, self-contained, unemotional sentiment which is as unlike true religious worship as the other and as abnormal. It is true that the abnormal manifestations of the emotion are governed by the same laws and are produced by the same causes as other subjective phenomena. Suggestion plays its part in these as in other things pertaining to the attributes of the soul, and in these, as in all others, a wrong, extravagant, or misdirected suggestion produces abnormal results. But this does not argue that the emotion is abnormal. There is no emotion of the human soul that has not its abnormal manifestations when not directed and controlled by reason. The common experience of everyday life demonstrates this proposition. One of the most sacred and praiseworthy of all the human emotions is that of love between the sexes. But the fact that our jails are filled with those who have indulged in its abnormal manifestations does not argue that the institution of marriage is abnormal. The sentiment of worship is as widespread as the sentiment of love, and that very fact shows that it must be taken into account in the diagnosis of the human entity if we would arrive at correct conclusions. That this sentiment is universal and is repressed only by an effort of will, no one will deny. It is its abnormal manifestations merely that are to be guarded against. Like every other emotion of the soul, its normal indulgence is in the highest degree healthful and exalting. The normal expression of the emotion of earthly love brings us into harmonious relations with our fellow beings. The normal expression of the emotion of worship brings the soul into harmonious relations with its Creator. Every form and act of worship is an expression of this emotion. It is experienced by all races of the human family, from the fetish worshiper to the Christian. Each stands in awe and reverence before some superior power, external to himself, and capable of controlling his destiny. In proportion to his intelligence will his conceptions of that power be exalted, and in proportion to the exaltation of his conceptions will be the intensity of his emotions of awe, reverence, love, worship. The conclusions which necessarily follow are of the most important character. The first and most important, for it includes all the rest, is that the fact of the existence of the emotion of worship is demonstrative of the existence of a supreme being. And right here I wish to make an important distinction. The standard theological argument in favor of the immortality of the soul is based upon the following syllogism. 1. There is a universal desire for immortality. 2. The mind of man cannot conceive an object of desire the means for the attainment of which are not somewhere in existence. Conclusion. Man is necessarily immortal. Now, if these premises were demonstrably correct, we might safely rely upon the conclusion. But they are not correct. The first may be assumed to be practically true, for the sake of the argument, but the desire for continued life beyond the grave may be explained upon other grounds, namely, upon the instinctive desire to prolong life. This instinct is shared with man by all the animal creation and pertains, primarily, to the preservation of animal existence. Man soon learns that continued animal existence is impossible. He sees that all must die, but, as hope springs eternal in the human breast, he conceives the hope that he may, somehow, live after the death of the body. The existence of the desire for immortality is, therefore, traceable directly to the purely animal instinct of self-preservation. The second premise is intrinsically absurd. It is obvious that the brain of man may conceive of many objects of desire which are manifestly impossible of realization, as well as non-existent. In the Christian mythology of Milton, the idea is developed of a rival power, Satan, in heaven almost, but not quite, equal to God. In the struggle which ensued from a rebellion of Satan, he was cast out and set up a kingdom of his own on this earth. Now, a strictly orthodox person might say that this was merely an allegorical representation of an existent fact. But suppose the poet had gone a step further and had represented Satan as going outside the universe and setting up a rival universe of his own. Would that conception have proved that an outside universe is possible or existent? Again, the existence of a supreme being is thought to have been demonstrated by the argument of Socrates, wherein the confuted Aristodemus the atheist and used the statues of Polycletus and the pictures of Zeuxis to illustrate the idea that, as the structure of the universe shows evidence of design, therefore there must have been a designer. Theology has never improved upon this argument, and Paley makes the same use of the watch for an illustration as Socrates did of the statues and pictures. It is a strong argument, but it does not reach the point which the human heart desires to have demonstrated. Nor does it add force to, but rather weakens, the argument which is found by all reflecting minds in every tree, leaf, bud, or flower. It simply proves the existence of a force, which all admit. What the human heart desires, and what the human mind seeks, are proofs of the existence of a God, not of mere intelligence and potentiality, but such a God as Jesus characterized, a God of love and benevolence. A God who sustains the relation of Father to all humanity. It seems to me that in seeking within the realm of human desire for an argument and proof either of immortality or the existence of a supreme being. Theologians have failed to make a necessary distinction between desires which may or may not be universal and inherent, and desires which have their source in the affectional emotions. It is upon the latter only that an argument can be logically predicated. And I may go further and say that an argument logically predicated upon the affectional emotions is demonstrative. It is true that some of the emotions of the soul seem to pertain exclusively to this life, but not all. The emotion of religious worship pertains solely to that invisible power which we call God. Nevertheless, we may employ the others for illustration. Let us see how this doctrine applies to the subject under consideration. Putting it in syllogistic form, we have the following. 1. The affectional emotions are universal attributes of every normally developed human mind. 2. No affectional emotion can have an existence in the normally developed human mind in the absence of an object of affection capable of reciprocal feeling. Therefore, when a normally developed human being experiences the emotion of love or affection, there is necessarily existent an object of love or affection normally capable of reciprocal emotion. Thus, the emotion of friendship presupposes the friendly relation existing between man and his fellow man. The emotion of sexual love presupposes the sexual relation and the existence of persons of the opposite sex normally capable of reciprocal emotion. The emotion of parental love presupposes the relation of parent and child, each normally capable of reciprocal attachment. It follows that the emotion of religious worship presupposes the existence of an object of worship capable of reciprocal affection. If this is not the correct interpretation of the universal sentiment of worship which is inherent in the breast of every normal human being, then there is an exception to the laws which govern every other human emotion. As there are no exceptions in the operation of nature's laws, the conclusion is inevitable, not only that the emotion of religious worship is normal, but that it is the one phenomenal attribute of the soul which gives to man indubitable evidence of his divine origin and demonstrates the existence of a God of love. It is the connecting link between man and his Creator. It is the instinctive manifestation of filial affection which proclaims our divine pedigree and demonstrates the universal brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. The end. Background of Thompson J. Hudson. Biographical. Thompson J. Hudson was born at Windham, Portage County, Ohio, on the 22nd day of February, 1834. His American ancestry is traced back on both sides of the house to the colonial period, his paternal forebear having landed at Jamestown, Virginia, with Captain John Smith in 1607, and his maternal ancestor, Governor William Bradford, at Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1620. His early life was spent on a farm, where he bore the brunt of the hardships incident to farm life in days before agricultural machinery lightened its labors. To this, as well as to heredity on both sides of his house, he owed his robust health and iron constitution. His early education was acquired in the common schools of his neighborhood and at an academy in a neighboring town. It was here that some of the characteristics of his adult life first asserted themselves. He refused to be bound by precedent or to submit to authority in the matter of his education. While he followed the prescribed course faithfully, he insisted on adding such studies as he deemed valuable. For instance, he surprised his common school teacher on one occasion by announcing his intention to study natural philosophy, chemistry, and logic, then and there. It is said, however, that young Hudson was aided and abetted in his scheme of private education by a learned uncle, who loaned him books and gave him private instruction. The sorrow and disappointment of his life came when he was prepared to enter college. It was then that his father announced to him that there was one condition, and only one, upon which he would consent to give him a college education, and that was that he should enter the ministry. This the young man flatly refused to promise, and expressed his desire and determination to study for the bar, adding that he could not conscientiously preach the theological dogmas in which he did not believe. The result was that the young man abruptly left the paternal roof under circumstances that would have daunted a nature less energetic, determined, and hopeful than his. He pursued his studies, however, with unabated zeal, reciting to private tutors, so that by the time he was admitted to the bar he was fairly well equipped for battling with the world. His career as a lawyer was, however, destined to be of short duration. In 1860, he removed to Port Huron, Michigan, and in 1865 he definitely abandoned his profession and entered the field of journalism and politics. He never but once sought a political office for himself, and that was in 1866, when he became his party's candidate for senator. He was defeated, however, his party being in the minority. He made a strong canvass on the occasion and established a reputation as a campaign orator. Soon after this, he sold out his paper and removed to Detroit, where he became editor-in-chief of the Detroit Daily Union. In this field, he achieved a notable success and soon became widely known as a brilliant editorial writer. A few years after this, the Union was merged with the Detroit Evening News, and he became one of the principal editorial writers on that paper. In 1877, he was induced to go to Washington as the correspondent of the Scripps Syndicate, which then consisted of 5 daily papers, published, respectively, in Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. He served in this capacity for several years, but in the meantime he was offered a position on the examining corps of the United States Patent Office. He accepted this position in 1880 and continued in the service for more than 13 years. He was rapidly promoted, and in 1886 was made principal examiner and placed in charge of one of the scientific divisions of the Patent Office. He served in that capacity with distinguished ability until after the publication of his first book, in 1893, The Law of Psychic Phenomena. Without violence to the truth, it may be said that one morning, in 1893, Dr. Hudson awoke to find himself famous throughout the English-speaking world. His book found an enormous sale, which still continues in a constantly increasing ratio. It was followed 2 years later by A Scientific Demonstration of the Future Life. By many, the latter book is preferred, but his first great work will be the standard by which posterity will estimate his standing as a pioneer in the scientific survey of the whole past field of psychical research. These were in turn followed by The Divine Pedigree of Man, and in 1903 by The Law of Mental Medicine. The latter was published only a few days before Dr. Hudson's death, which occurred at his home in Detroit, May 26, 1903, after a severe attack of heart trouble. In recognition of his work, Dr. Hudson was honored with the degree of Doctor of Laws by St. John's College, Maryland, and with Ph.D. by Ewing College, Illinois. End of book.